I remember getting a call from some senior legal employee at the company, and he just says, I'll never forget, this is one of those things where people are going to be asking who's getting fired over this. I'm like, great. Okay. Well, that person's probably going to be me.
That's Anthony Scarpaci. He's the former growth leader for companies like Acorns, NerdWallet, Blue Apron, and Betterment. And today runs his own growth advisory called TUNOMATIC. If you're new here, my name is Andrew, and in this show, I have candid conversations with my guests about some of the toughest moments in their careers. Anthony shared 3 of his. The first is when he made a massive mistake at work and was told by one of the senior executives that he was probably going to get fired over it. The second is when he got feedback in his formal 360 review that he was too nice as a leader. And the third is when he came back from his wedding in Italy and had to perform layoffs at 8 a.m. the very next morning. We covered a ton of ground in this conversation. There is both a mix of tough moments that Anthony has navigated and advice for others who are encountering similar situations. I think you're going to love it. Let's jump right in.
I think for me, in my career, I have been so focused on being this perfect employee, top right box, high potential, high performance in those around me in my peer group that I only maybe last 4 or 5 years did the work on myself to actually reflect on values, what was driving some of my motivations for perfectionism and everything that both helped me get to where I am, but was getting in the way. And then just that ideal version of myself that I was trying to demise, just like the businesses that I was in, and not allowing myself to understand that just like others around me, that's not what you're solving for. That perfect leader, perfect performance. You're human, you're blood and guts. So you got to understand that a little better.
It's so interesting, right? Because I feel like for a lot of us, we sort of put on this suit, so to speak, like a cloak sometimes when we go into work, especially when you get into a leadership position. And sometimes you have to do things that you think you need to do to get ahead. Other times you do things that don't feel good on the inside. Maybe you get feedback that's something you like about yourself and you kind of have to detangle. Who are you? Is there one you? Is there a work version of you? Is that different than the personal version? So I'm excited to dig into all that stuff with you because you've gone on to have objectively a very impressive career. And so let's explore it from where it begins. Like take us back in time. Tell us where you're from and what you were into as a kid.
Yeah, I grew up in Glenview, Illinois, a suburb of Chicago. So I'm a Midwesterner. And when I was young, I still am, I was really a geek. I would find different things and I would just go super deep on them, whether it was math. I was in math club in grade school. I started an alien club when I was like in 3rd grade. And so, I would find these things that I would obsess over.
What do you do in the alien club? I got to double click on this.
I think when we just had indoor recess, I would host like alien drawing competition. And then the winner would get some prize of like, I don't know, this alien toy.
That's awesome.
Yeah. So I'd always been somebody who had attached myself to things and got very borderline obsessive over them. And so I was just a very curious kid. And so through grade school and then through high school, the things that I really gravitated towards most were the arts and music. So I'd play guitar, moved to Nashville, Tennessee in the last 2 years to be closer to the music scene here. And it's been just such a passion of mine. And there's such a world in music and guitar, especially, that I've just fallen in love with it. So I thought when I was getting into college, I was going to try to get into the music business. And so I thought, okay, let me work at some music venues on campus. I went to Indiana University, which has a good music school and a good business school. So it was one of those few places in the country that I could go deep with great education in both of those worlds simultaneously. And I worked at the Indiana University Auditorium, which was this big 3,000 seat venue, like almost 100 years old now. So a really beautiful institution that I got to go work in. And I thought this is going to be my world. I was going to be on the venue side, merge my loves of music and business. And then there was a point where, as I was getting a little closer to the industry, I saw some things that I didn't like as much. And I realized maybe it's best to have it at an arm's distance. And so, from there, then sort of I went down a more traditional business.
I've got a good friend of mine whose younger brother is in this space. At various points, he's been a tour manager for like some pretty popular hip hop artists. He's had event management stuff. He runs like a weather app for events. He's shared some of the underbelly of this world, and I can understand. It's tough out there.
And every place, every industry has it. But I think for me, one of the rejections I had to it was I encountered a case where an artist came in and I was dealing with his management because I worked in the front of house, meaning we had to set things like what were the camera policies, everything like that. And I remember I had to go backstage, talk with them, work through things. And this guy was just such a jerk. And he was also pretty incompetent. And I think it was at that point that I came up with this little 2x2 matrix in my mind. Us growth people love a 2x2 matrix. And it was an attitude and expertise matrix, which was I could work with somebody who is maybe a little abrasive and a jerk if they're really, really good at what they do. And there's a level of toleration I can have. And conversely, somebody has a great attitude and spirit and enthusiasm, but they still have quite a bit to learn. I'm happy to go spend time and coach them up and work with them. If you are both a jerk and you're terrible at your job, I have like zero tolerance. I encountered that a few times from some examples of nepotism, friends and other things being on the management teams for some of these artists. And I was just like, I got to take a step back from that world. But not to say that doesn't exist in other areas of business too, but that was part of my aversion.
Love a good 2x2. And what is your family into growing up? Like, do you come from a family of musicians? Do they work in tech? Tell us a little bit more about where you come from.
Yeah, pretty squarely middle class in the Midwest. And my dad, straight out of going to a trade high school, he started at the electric company in Chicago at 17 and worked there for over 40 years. So his whole career was that. And then my mother worked various jobs as teaching assistants or at country clubs as well, just as supplemental income. Not a lot of musicianship in the household. My grandfather, who I never met, played the drums. But other than that, there was a love for music. Definitely my father had a big love for all the classics, the Beatles, Rolling Stones, things like that, Roy Orbison, George Harrison. But it felt a little bit out of the blue that I attached myself so much to it. My sisters, I have two older sisters, and we all played some like woodwind instruments in grade school that lasted a year or two. I didn't keep it up. But come like 7th or 8th grade, I attached myself to guitar, started a band in 8th grade, be cool, think with the girls, all that stuff. And then I just fell in love with the instrument. Heavy metal guitar players down to the blues greats like Son House, Buddy Guy, B.B. King, and then sort of the rest is history.
And so how do you get from that world into SaaS? Because, right, it seems like, at least on your LinkedIn, maybe there's stops that you haven't included there. It seems like the vast majority of your career from the beginning has been really at badass tech companies. And so tell us the first few steps from the version of you that was in college, exploring music, thinking about working in auditoriums, seeing the side of music that maybe you didn't like or weren't as attracted to as much, and then how you started walking into this world.
A few things that happened around senior year. One was I went on a trip to Denver, Colorado to go hike, explore with one of my best friends before the school year started. And it was the first time I went out west and saw the Rockies, and I fell in love with it. I love hiking. And I was like, how do I get out here? Maybe I start my career out west to explore someplace new. And my older sister had moved to Europe already at this time, working at Hyatt. So I had some inspiration from those in my family to take these bolder moves for their career and to go really explore in their younger years. And so I said, yeah, maybe Colorado is the place for me. And fortunately, then the stars kind of aligned where a coworker of mine at the auditorium who was a year ahead of me got a job at Dish Network, who was based in Denver. And he encouraged me to apply, and they did college recruiting on campus. So I went through that process. They flew out finalists for interviews with the executive team in Denver, where they have the VPs and above interview all these 22-year-olds, 21-year-olds, not for specific roles to fill, but for the raw talents and raw potential to find that next cohort. And they really invested in that every year. So fortunately, I was able to go through that process and then get an offer. And during that process, there was a VP of retention there who was really kind of helping me identify what sort of job I wanted. And he saw in me a balance of, an analytical mindset and creativity. And he said, oh, marketing is great for you. You would be great on the marketing team. So I got a job in the marketing side. The week before I started my job, after I had moved there for a month, they called me to say, hey, your role's going to be a little different. You're not going to be on this team. You're going to be doing print. I was like, what is print? Okay.
You're like, screw it. I'm just happy to have a job.
I'm here. I'm going to be able to pay for my life and pay down my student debt. Great. So I go into this job, and that's where I learned this whole world of direct response marketing. And I was doing direct response print advertising, like freestanding inserts, which are inserted in newspapers, or it's called insert media that ride alongs with packages. And then this world of each of these ads has a unique toll-free number that can get tracked on it to a call center, that can be tracked to sales and the ARPU, right, and the lifetime value of the customers from that. And then I learned this whole world of the analytics side and the testing and experimentation side of marketing. And I fell in love with it and just started geeking out and obsessing about it. From there, I just worked my way through every marketing channel possible within Dish. They would give kids like me massive budgets of tens of millions of dollars and trusted to go experiment. And so I was doing that, continuing to try to prove myself to the leadership team, trying to knock on the door of the CMO to get as many skip level one-on-ones as I could to show my face and get opportunities. And then my partner at the time wanted to move to New York after a few years being at Dish. And I said, there's no better city for marketing than New York. So why not continue the adventure and explore a new place? So moving to New York, the stars just aligned where I was doing research on different companies. I was traditionally looking at bigger institutions and telecom and financial services where I thought my skills would apply most. And then I remember having a moment on my computer just being like, screw it. Let me just look at what are the coolest startups and coolest companies in New York. And Betterment popped up. I looked into it more. I'm like, oh my gosh, I love this. I'm a geek on personal finance. This is my world. I have a whole, spreadsheet for all of my personal finances. And I was obsessed with Mint at the time. And I was like, this would be amazing. And I go to the jobs career page, and they literally needed a growth marketing manager who had experience with digital and offline channels. I'm like, this is perfect. And so I applied cold, did everything with the follow-up messages, but I got a call back from them and had a few interviews, went out there for final interviews, and fortunately got the role. And it was honestly one of the rare times that I had gone through that sort of pure recruiting process proactively to get a job. And it just worked out that way. And then from there, it just continued to snowball.
Yeah, off to the races from there. And so, I want to double click on some of the tough moments. I know you're at Dish for a while, and that was kind of your first stop. Usually it's folks at their first job or two that they have these massive learning moments, usually for when something painful happens. I've had a bunch of them. And I'm curious if there's one that comes to mind for you from the earliest. Could be Dish or could be at Betterment, a time when you had a moment that was tough at the time, but maybe led to some massive personal growth later.
Yes. At Dish, I had one of the scariest moments of my career. As I mentioned, I was responsible for print advertising, and one of those channels was Val, which is, for those that don't know, this shared mailer that goes out. There's a bunch of little single pages of advertisements for various services. And we were sending millions of pieces of Val ads every month that I was responsible for. And they were a great platform for running A/B tests with creative. So I always had a queue of experiment. And Dish Network at the time was always focused on marketing the $19.99 price point, entry price point. It always converted the best. And so we had a clear playbook, and it was really more about the creative execution around it than it was the actual sort of pricing strategy that we promoted to drive the lowest customer acquisition costs, best ROI. But I had this idea at the time, well, maybe customers know there's a little bit of this bait and switch of they're not actually going to get $19.99. So they love some more clarity and visibility into the option that they have. And so I decided, let's run a test where we actually show a few of the different tiers of packages with the channel offerings and see if that increases response rate. Fortunately, it did. It was like 20+% lift in conversion rate improvement in CAC. So I was like, great, awesome, let's go roll it out. So we roll it out, and then I get a coworker of mine find me with one of the pieces that went out in this new sort of rolled out champion creative saying, hey, I saw this new ad. I'm like, yeah, isn't it great? It won in this test. We're so excited. It's amazing. He's like, the prices are wrong. I'm like, prices are. He's like, every price point was $5 lower than it actually is right now. What do you mean the prices are wrong? How is that possible? And long story short, what had happened was we launched that test. And since I was the only one ever doing any ads that had these other price points, we were just ready to pick up that ad format and roll that out 100% in the next mailing. But that was also the time at the company that we did change all of the pricing for these other tiers. And so nobody in the workflow between the creative director, myself as a channel manager, the legal reviewers, compliance reviewers for the ads caught it. And this thing goes out. So I'm like, what am I going to do now? This is not good. And it was at a time that the entire executive team, my VP, CMO, and CEO were all, I think, on a cruise ship with our indirect sales partners for their annual meeting. And so nobody was in the office and I had to go figure this out. So immediately on finding it out that day, I know there's people calling in on this ad. And so I just immediately went into, what do I do? Well, first is try and reduce the blast radius of this. So I called our agency in New York, said, we got to try to pull this ad if it hasn't been distributed across all the regions yet, to get as few of these out there as possible. You know, I ran after that to try to reduce how many ads were in market. I then had to call the sales team to let them know the news, which they probably already knew because their customer service reps were getting these inbound calls about a price that doesn't exist, and had to work with them to establish a plan for them to honor those lower price points, communicate that to all the call centers across the country. And then, you know, I had to alert the legal team and I had to go alert my executive team. And I thought, I'm not going to have a job after this. This is bad. And I remember getting a call after I did my initial outreach to the legal team to let them know. I got a call from some senior legal employee at the company. And mind you, this is over, 1,000 corporate employees. I don't know anybody. I'm a young IC and I'm talking to this person I don't know. I'm sure has much more authority than I do in the company. And he just says, I'll never forget. This is one of those things where people are going to be asking who's getting fired over this. I'm like, great. Okay. Well, that person's probably going to be me. Okay. So let me just at least just wrap this up in a little bow as my little exit of the company and do my best to exit gracefully. And I sent, an email update, detailed email to the executives, letting them know what happened, the rationale or the reason behind it, what steps we're already taking, who I was working with on all of it. And I just sent it out. I was like, well, I'm just going to do everything within my power, but I got to own it.
And is all this like same day? Like you talked to the person in legal, same day?
Yeah, I probably blacked out in this day of just like everything happening. I was just like.
And this is during the time when everyone's in the office, right?
Everyone's in the office, minus the executives.
And are people looking at you? Like, are you just like hiding at your desk? Did you go in a conference room and post up? Like, what are you doing during this day?
No, I was in my low wall gray cubicle. So everybody could see me and my fresh bald head from across the floor. There's 100 marketers on the floor. So everybody knows, everybody can see me. Quite the pressure. And I just remember like, I can't sit and cower. I just got to own it, go to the people that I know I got to work with, call it out, put a spotlight on it, and then say, let's go solve it. That's all I could do. And it ended up surprisingly working out. And I think a few things that were helpful from that experience were by owning it and not deflecting any of the blame to others, I built incredible trust and clout with the rest of the organization, because I could have blamed the creative sort of leadership. I could have blamed the compliance officer who reviewed the creative. I didn't call out any of them at any points or yell at them in the process. I just said, like, there's a problem. How do we go solve this? I know I'm ultimately the owner of this marketing channel. I take full accountability for it.
And was that intentional? Was that instinct? Where did that come from, do you think?
Part of it is probably just like core to who I am. I think another part of it was being mindful to know that it wasn't going to help anybody if I put blame on anybody else. It doesn't solve anything. We're trying to like solve problems. We're not trying to protect ourselves. I think thinking about it further, I do remember there was also a moment of like, I'm so young in my career relative to these other people. Like I have probably more resiliency than some of these other folks do. So if anybody's going to be scapegoat, let it be me. Like I'll figure it out. I think there's a little bit of that too, but yeah, it ended up being good. And I think I'm glad it happened because I think it also gave me this rare opportunity as a low level employee to highlight how I can manage a crisis to the executive team. And in a way, probably build a relationship faster with them for future opportunities. And it ended up actually coming full circle because the CMO at Dish at the time that I was knocking on his door, trying to build a relationship and having these crises under, ended up becoming the CMO at Acorns. And so I then came full circle to work for him as his head of growth years later. So it worked out in a weird way.
Do you remember the first executive that you made contact with afterwards? You said they were on a cruise, but I'm just curious if it was a phone call, if it was an email, and what that was like.
So the one person that was in the office that was not on this, offsite was the SVP of sales within the company, who was a legacy employee. I think he had been there for over 20 years. And he was in the office across the building after I got our plan in action, was working with his team members on how we were going to go do everything. I went over to his office to check in and just introduce myself, say, I'm here. If there's anything else that you need me to go do, let me know. I've done X, Y, and Z. And I just remember the tension in the room and the dagger eyes that I got from him. It was this stern, you know how big of a deal this is, right? And I was like, yes. And he's just like, okay, go get it done. And it was a very short conversation. The gravity landed on me, if it didn't already at that point, from his tone and just presence. Big Irish guy, very commanding. I understood the pressure and I went to go solve it as best I could.
Does this change the way that you manage other people later in your career? Right? Because you have this massive moment, the worst case scenario doesn't happen. You kind of share it as a growth moment where actually it ends up being a moment where you're able to showcase skills that you wouldn't normally be able to showcase, even though in an intense environment. You're able to work with executives in a way that most people don't. And because you owned it, you've built up all this trust and cachet. I'm guessing that there have been folks who have reported to you directly or indirectly who have made fuck ups along the way. And do you think about this moment, and does it change the way that you interact with those people in those moments?
I definitely have had those moments. One thing that is maybe a little bit different when those have happened under me is I had already sort of built a certain rapport and trust with my team at that point, where I would like to say that they all felt very proud of their work, supported by me, and had a sense of agency in what they were doing, that by the time there was a mistake, it didn't require me to communicate to them the gravity of it, or that they should be disappointed or feel like that didn't meet their expectations or my expectation. I feel like every time there had been a crisis anywhere close to that under my team, those individuals came with actually like more guilt on their own. And I had to like help pull them up to say, yes, this isn't great, but let's focus on what you can control. Let's go fix it. Let's make sure it doesn't happen next time, and let's learn from it. So I never had to play the role of reinforcing to somebody that this is not okay. Whether that was subliminal in my leadership style or something I did intentionally, and the caliber and quality of the people that I had the pleasure to work with, I just never had that situation that I had to sort of come in with that level of sternness that I experienced.
I actually was curious if you went further the other way in terms of kindness and empathy, because you've been on the other side. And even with the best of intentions, when you work in tech, things move quickly. And when you move quickly, there's mistakes. And if you're not making mistakes, it probably means you're moving too slow. And that would be worse, in my opinion, than not making mistakes. And so I actually was curious if it went too far the other way, but it sounds like no.
I think the teams that I've had in the later roles have always been a group of people that have been really proud of their work, curious and wanting to push the envelope and learn and know the risks. And then it's been for me and other executives to set the tone and the culture to say, this is how we operate. We operate with speed. We expect things are not going to work, but we take ownership and accountability of those things when they're mistakes versus failed experiment that happens all the time.
For me in my journey, I never minded when folks made mistakes as long as they learned from it. The things that were harder for me is after I became a leader, sometimes when I would get feedback on my leadership style, those were the things that kind of kept me up at night, that sort of threw me off of my game a little bit more so than the mistakes on my team. I'm curious, what's some feedback for you that maybe shook you a little bit when you heard it the first time?
Going back to the management side, I felt like I never had to apply greater pressure than I already was with the team that I had, but I had feedback from executives that I was too nice. And what was interesting was...
Like formal feedback, like in a 360 review, or more like informal conversations?
Yeah, these were like in my formal reviews. And when I really picked at that a little bit more, it was less so about my management, members of my team, and it was more so working across and working up, managing up. And I think as I drilled into a little bit more, some of the underlying parts of that were, it made it seem like I was just there to serve somebody else and I wouldn't put on their ideas and their vision. And I would just really be an agent of what they wanted to do versus speak up when I had good ideas where I disagreed with those team members. And so that was a little bit of a shock to me because I had always wanted to be an example of showing you don't have to be a jerk to be successful and to be a leader in a company, because that's the default position, is all the executives have to be mean and stern and unapproachable. And so I was like, I just don't want to operate that way. I don't want to be that person. So let me see if I can successfully thwart that stereotype. But after that defensiveness moment, I also realized there's wisdom to take from that about how to stand your ground from those that feel more powerful than you within an organization in a way that's respectful and informed and thoughtful. And so that was something I had to really work on, to know how and when to respectfully disagree. And one thing that has helped me in that process to get me more comfortable with that was use data, use the objective data to tell the story versus it having to be the strength of my charisma or my language. Let me make a defensible case that tells the story for me. So that was, I don't want to say a crutch, but it was a very helpful tool to get me more comfortable in those moments where I had really strong opinions that diverged from the path that my manager or other executives wanted to take.
This episode of the show is brought to you by Navattic. In fall of 2024, Navattic just launched their free plan, which allows product-led SaaS businesses like yours to publish and share interactive demos. So I was super excited to have Natalie, who's their head of growth, come back on the show. She's been on before to tell us all about the decisions that happened to enable the freemium launch. Because after being sales-led for 3 years, there were a ton of details to detangle, and we explored them all. Why freemium versus free trial, how this fits into Navattic's strategy, how they were able to get sales and customer success on the same page, their rollout plan, and of course, the KPIs they're using to track success. Subscribers to the show will remember that back in May, I actually published an 8-part interview series with Natalie and her colleague Raman from the Navattic growth team. And in that series, we talked about if freemium might be a part of Navattic's future. At the time, it was still in the idea phase. So this was a major update. In the conversation, we covered a ton of ground. It's going to be interesting and educational for anyone thinking about launching freemium or anyone who's already running a freemium program today that wants to see under the hood of another business. Catch our entire conversation either on my YouTube channel, just look for the behind the scenes playlist on my main page, or by searching for behind the scenes on any of the major podcast platforms under the Delivering Value podcast umbrella. I hope you enjoy. This episode is presented by Appcues. If you work in product-led growth, you know how important activating and engaging new accounts is. Turning new accounts into active users is critical to your success in a PLG environment, and typically why activated accounts is a North Star metric for growth teams. It's why my team spent years focused on improving our new user onboarding experience during my time at Wistia and at Postscript. And that's why I'm so excited that Appcues is sponsoring the show. They're just as passionate about helping product-led companies fix their onboarding and their retention as I am. They're the leading product onboarding and adoption platform for web and mobile apps, and they've helped over 1,500 SaaS orgs create exceptional onboarding experiences that convert new users into power users and brand advocates. So if you're looking for help activating more new accounts, head to appcues.com/value. They have a free new user onboarding audit, which is done by Romley John. He literally wrote the book on new user onboarding, and he's a close personal friend of mine. For help, head to appcues.com/value. This is an example of kind of one of those things that we were just talking about at the beginning of our conversation, where there's something about yourself, probably that you like, right? This is probably a part of you that makes you magical in your personal connections outside of work. But now you're getting feedback on it where it's sort of your kryptonite in the office. And so I don't want to project my thoughts onto you here, but do you get into a place where you have to make a decision? Like, do I want to change who I am to get ahead at work? Like, did you feel any of that?
There was at least one point in my career where there were others I was working with where I thought, I'm going to either have to change my behavior and be a type of person I don't want to be, or I'm going to need to leave, or this person is going to need to leave. And ultimately, I had others who saw what I saw and were validating in how I was handling the situation. Ultimately, that other individual then ended up leaving the company. But that was the only point where I thought there's this misalignment in values of how we operate in the company that would cause me actually to make a decision to leave a business, because I was getting pushed up against the ways that I want to work, the ways I want to set an example for others. And I guess it was a good test to say, oh, I was that convicted in that I was willing to make that sort of career decision because of it. Fortunately, that's been rare.
I've gotten this feedback, for what it's worth, from someone who I worked with, another manager, a peer of mine, who one day pulled me into the hallway or pulled me into the stairwell, so to speak, and said, your team's taking advantage of you, or like you're being too soft to your team or something like that. And I disagreed. I just thought we had different styles and it was a matter of preference. I don't think my team would have said I'm too soft on them. My feedback style was maybe more quiet but direct, and his was maybe a little bit louder and more assertive in the moments. And then maybe he backed off of it a little bit later privately. I don't really know. But I remember thinking the same thing and thinking, I think this is a matter of preference, but this is someone that has a lot of cachet here, and probably both of these styles can't be leading. And so I ended up leaving not long after that. And so that's really interesting that you went through a similar thing and then it worked out the other way for you.
For me, on that being too nice feedback, there was also a piece of, and this was earlier on, of knowing how to deliver constructive feedback to my team. Because when I was a first-time manager, I felt very uncomfortable on telling somebody that they were not meeting my expectations or they're not doing a good job. And it was particularly hard because, going back to what I was saying before, of being this hustling employee trying to grow my career as fast as possible, I was oftentimes put in positions where I had people on my team who were older than me. And that felt like a big complexity to the relationship. And I didn't know how to navigate that and how to say, well, I know how something should be done and you may not, even though you've been on this earth longer and maybe in this company longer. That was something I did also have to work through. But to what you're saying about management style, there's still a way to do that with empathy, directness that has a tone and isn't aggressive, abrasive.
Finding the voice is hard. I always tried to just be authentic to myself because I felt like the leaders who I didn't respect and I didn't want to be like were the ones that always felt phony, and you could just tell it was like, quit putting on for us. Just fucking talk to us. Shoot me straight. Like I remember always having that feeling about other managers. And so I just think if you're a naturally super assertive person, then you're going to be a great assertive manager. But if you're a little bit, I don't want to say less assertive because that makes it seem like a negative, but if your feedback style is a little bit softer, even if it's direct and your team understands what's important and where they need to take action and where they can improve and what they're doing great, then I think that you should just stay authentic. And that's something that took me a little bit of time to detangle. And so it makes sense that when you're managing other people who are older than you, more senior than you, maybe they've been in the game longer than you, worked at the company longer than you. Maybe you're in a position where you get a promotion over some of your friends, and all of a sudden you have to manage them. Those are tough, and those are tough moments for new leaders. I'm curious, did you read any books, or were there any resources that helped you here? The one that's coming to mind for me is like the famous Kim Scott book, Radical Candor. Did you end up reading that or anything similar?
I didn't actually. Probably should have. No, I think, the one other thing I would drill in on that you mentioned on the authenticity side is paired with that is transparency and context. And what was really helpful for me was, especially later when I got to a point that I was managing teams and scopes of work where I could no longer have my hands directly on everything and know the ins and outs of every single thing happening. Because where I thrived was in places where I could go so deep that I knew everything back of my hand. But what I realized was also very helpful was be very, very clear on what does success look like? What is the context for why we're making certain decisions, or why there's complexity or ambiguity around a certain initiative, whether it's product, marketing, budget decision, budgetary decisions. And by giving all those contexts, those pieces context and those guardrails and those measures of success, it really helped the team understand the why when I was giving them feedback on what we had to do or why we had to change, which also made it much easier to accept the feedback for them, understand and not internalize the feedback or the changes or the guidance I was giving as a criticism or critique on them, but they were able to map it to what are the business decisions that are happening, or maybe even there were internal politics, but at least they would understand there's disagreements between different functions. And so until we have a decision on this, we need to operate in this way. And that would help take the emotions out of it and focus more on itself.
And it kind of takes you out of it also, right? You just happen to be the person sharing that information, but the information is an objective truth, so to speak. And so it's interesting. There's a lot of challenges I feel like that come with being a leader. And so I'm curious for you, is there another challenging moment that you had to overcome in your leadership journey in addition to the feedback around your assertiveness and being a little bit too nice and holding your ground that comes to mind?
Of course, there are many, but I think the other most pivotal one or types are when conducting layoffs, to do layoffs. And there was a time in my career when I moved to become the head of marketing of a mid-sized business. And I would say I didn't know enough at the time on what questions to ask during the recruiting process, nor when I was in those initial months of onboarding, knowing where within other functions of the company I should be asking more questions or applying some more pressure or accountability on, particularly on, on the finance side and understanding how things were working financially within the organization. And about a year into it, we had to do a round of layoffs, which was maybe just a few years. They had also done another round of layoffs before that. So I come in very enthusiastic, hire the team, start scaling marketing spend with that team, setting this roadmap, checking in with others that we have the budget to go fund this, that these plans are great, got no constructive feedback. I was also developing a lot of the process that didn't exist before I joined. And then later in that experience, I get what feels like blindsided on the nature of the health of the organization. And so we had to conduct these layoffs. And I was frustrated because I was like, well, there's not too long of a history here of knowing we had to go reset with talent. What did we not get right that time or learn from? And then I was part of that process now because I had hired out of that latest round of layoffs thinking we were in a good place. And so that was the first time that I had to go deliver that news and make those decisions. And, there were people impacted who were recent parents. And so there's a huge emotional toll of working through that. And the worst part was I was about to get married and there was pressure from the board to do these on a certain day. And I was like, I cannot do this. Can we move it to this? You were
getting married the next day?
Yes. So I asked the CEO, can we do it on this day? Because I want to go deliver the feedback, but I'm not going to be here. And I this is a non-negotiable to be offline. And he had said, no, I'm going to go do it. And then we'll let you know how it goes. I'm like, I felt so terrible. But then I come back from overseas, like on the tarmac Sunday night, check my phone to see like what happened, how the process went. Then I find out they're doing it the next morning.
Oh, so they delayed it.
They delayed it. And this is like 11 o'clock PM on JFK tarmac. And I'm already jet lagged. I'm like waiting like 7-8 hours. I'm going to have to start making calls the next morning. I am not ready for this.
You had no idea. Had you not checked your email, you just would have gone into work thinking, hey, the vibe's going to be weird. They just did these layoffs. I don't know how long your honeymoon was, a week, 2 weeks, whatever it was, 3 weeks. But now you're going into work and you're the person who's going to have to let the people go. Like that was on the schedule. It wasn't like, hey, you're going to be there, but we're going to do it because we know it's your first day back.
No.
Oh my God.
So then that morning, I have a call with the CEO, say like, okay, what happened? All right, I'll do this. Give me the tools I need. We're going to start making the calls at this time. And we were a fully remote company. This was before COVID, but we were fully remote. So I had to do it all as calls. And anyway, it wasn't in person, but yeah, it was pretty cool. So that was really frustrating. Important experience to have because going through that experience, it made me even more diligent and made sure that I was really asking another depth questions within my organizations when I was building hiring plans and understanding the mechanics of the organization to at least do what was within my control to make sure I was hiring prudently and responsibly, not contributing something that results in layoffs.
So I feel like the details are unique to your story, but I think this lesson is a very common lesson to learn as you get hired into a new leadership role. It's different, I think, when you get promoted within a company and you go from a senior doer to all of a sudden a new manager or a leader in whatever way that's defined. But I feel like there's a lot of examples of folks who go through the interview process to become a leader at a new company and they spend the time selling themselves. And at the end of the interview, you get 3 minutes to ask a couple questions and you ask whatever's top of mind. And the real experienced leaders call their own rounds at the end. And they do their diligence as part of that interview process. And I think that's something that a lot of folks don't know that they even could do or should do, or if they did do it, what even to ask. And so this is one of those moments for you where maybe some version of that is what happened with you, where you're trying to sell yourself and you ask a few questions, but you don't even think to ask this kind of stuff. And now all of a sudden you have this experience that changes maybe the way that you interview from then on.
Yeah, totally. And I think it also, for somebody like me, highlights the need to try to build as much leverage as you can where you are with your career and your personal life so that you can do those things. Because I felt like earlier in my career, the leverage was always with the company. I was just lucky enough to be in the interview process, to be a finalist. I can't rock the boat or challenge them. This is the one opportunity I'm really excited about. I don't want to screw it up by pissing somebody off or insinuating anything. So whether that's through just building a path towards financial independence or doing it out of being within a role that you're modestly or moderately sort of comfortable with, that gives you, I think, a little bit more leverage to ask those hard questions, be okay if the answer is no, and go from there. And I think for me now, now that I've moved into advising and consulting after I role at Acorns, which I left beginning of this year, I feel like I'm in this unique position where if there's a point at which I do want to go back in-house within a company, or even better yet, support, advise a company or work with them on a contract basis, I have all the ability and all the leverage in the world. And that's definitely a luxury, of course, right now. But that's something that I think about as I'm looking for what's next in my career.
That comment is timely and hits home for me because just last week I fired a client just because they were draining my energy and not respecting my boundaries. And it's a privilege to be able to do that for sure, but also a necessity sometimes. So that hits home for me. So going back to this moment, so come back from your honeymoon, relaxed. Actually, where'd you go on the honeymoon? I should have asked.
So this was just right after the wedding. We got married in Italy because, funny enough, it's cheaper in Italy to get married than it is in Brooklyn. So we said, let's just do a destination wedding with a small of our closest friends and family. And we were able to do like 4 or 5 days and host everybody at a villa. And it was the same cost as renting a warehouse in Brooklyn for So,
And where was it? What part of Italy?
it was in Tuscany.
Oh, beautiful. Yeah, beautiful. Okay. So you come back from Tuscany. I don't know if you're relaxed, but 5 days in Tuscany sounds all right. Probably full of red wine and good beef. And so you come back, you have this moment. I imagine at the end of that first day back, between the jet lag and the emotional toll, you're drained. You have to be. And so how does someone navigate what happens next? Because I think there's a lot of people right now that have had to make tough decisions. The details are different, right? Maybe not coming right back from a trip or whatever, but a lot of folks right now that have had to have layoffs or protect their energy a little bit. And so I'm curious what happens next for you in the journey after this moment. Hey, real quick, before we hear back from Anthony, I want to interrupt for just a second to ask you to engage with the show on whatever platform you're currently listening on. You can subscribe or like on YouTube or leave a review on Apple or Spotify or whatever streaming platform you prefer. The algorithms seem to really like those signals. And as your host, I'd really appreciate it too. Okay, back to the combo.
Yeah, I think one thing that I did was I reached out to mentors of mine through that process, those who had seen this before, been part of this before, to help contextualize it for me. And that was very helpful and therapeutic in a way, because again, you feel like the whole world is on your shoulders and you're carrying somebody else's livelihood in your hand. Yeah, it just feels like the world is crumbling. So to talk to other people who have gone through that process before, that really helped me get out of my head a little bit on it and not spiral too deeply. That was very helpful. I think the other thing that was helpful was making sure to create space outside of work, especially when I was, probably 70 plus hours a week, like during that time, because you're in crisis building up to that decision. And then I was also planning this wedding with all these friends and family members, some of which had never been overseas. So there's all sorts of complexity. I have a tendency sometimes to oversubscribe myself with things like that. And I got to sort of realize, okay, I also need to make sure I create some real margin here outside of this work right now. So that was through exercise and also, playing music in the city, going back to that. That was really, really helpful for me to find a way to channel that energy in a more productive way.
Going back in time, are there certain soft skills that you wished you had worked on that would have been helpful for you in your leadership journey? And if so, maybe what's one that comes to mind?
The biggest one is delivering critical feedback that lands well and doesn't trigger somebody else to shut down. So I think, we covered that a little bit earlier, but I do think that was one it took me quite a bit to land successfully when I started to manage earlier in my career. I think it's so critical. I think one that I felt like came a little bit more naturally to me, but I would say is probably my superpower, arguably, from feedback I've gotten from others, is the ability to understand when there's disagreements within other members of your team and get them on the same page and rowing in the same direction when there's, high conflict or high tension. And I think what had helped me figure that out, I had, when I was younger, I had 2 older sisters. So there's a lot of negotiation. I didn't necessarily win hardly any of them, but earlier in my career, and I learned how to understand, listen first before you speak, seek to understand what other people are solving for, what pressures are on them, and what success looks like. Name those things and name those for all parties in the room, and then allow everybody to see where the other person is actually coming from, what pressure, what they're solving for. And then that helps a much more productive conversation come about in terms of, well, how can you address things that people want and the things that people are trying to avoid in a way that more often than not, you can actually find a solution that makes everybody happy because they feel heard and understood, like you were calling out earlier in the conversation, and then gets people towards the right direction. But that is something that, it's funny, I did that exercise in my last company. We were asking, what do we think each other's superpowers are? And people were saying, Anthony, your ability to like come into a tense environment, get everybody on the same page is something that it seems a little less common than I would hope.
And how about on the other side? I'm always curious to know if you have any notes to yourself, whether it's like a sticky note or an affirmation somewhere. And if the answer is yes, if you're comfortable sharing it with us.
Yeah, it's funny. I'm looking at my computer right now. I have 2 things on my computer. One is be intentional, which is for me all about, especially in this space where I'm now doing advising, I can theoretically say yes to everything and oversubscribe myself, like I was saying before, but being really, really focused and intentional on what are the things that I want to be doing, I should be doing with my time, both for the brands that I work with and then my personal sort of development and fulfillment. Make sure that I'm always making the space to not just get caught up in all the Slacks and the emails and the other things that are pulling me in different directions, but really set agenda and intentions for the day. So that's really key. And then the other one that I have are 3 notes from this great session guitar player, Tom Bukovac, and who's based in Nashville. And there's this guitar wisdom that translates, I think, broadly to life for me. They were loosen up. Sometimes with guitar playing, people get really tight, especially if you're like a blues guy. And sometimes when you're tight, you're too rigid then, and you're not flowing and you're not sounding natural. You're not creating the best work or creating the best sound. So loosening up, don't rush. That's another thing. A bad musician, you can tell a bad musician by somebody who plays way too fast ahead of the beat, doesn't know how to sit in the pocket, the rhythm section. But that's similar, right? Don't rush with your work, focus on quality, take the space. And then the third one is leave space, which is not to overdo it and do too much. So really focus on addition through subtraction. I think those 3 things are a good little mantra for me, both in sort of my passion for music and my work life, to ground me and center me.
And as folks listen to this and your story and some of the speed bumps and the lessons that you've picked up from those, what do you want to say that hasn't been said? What do you want them to take away from your journey that maybe we haven't touched on directly?
Yeah, I think one major thing we didn't really talk a little bit about that I would reinforce is how to give yourself some grace, particularly in the last few years. And right now, I'm sure a lot of growth leaders in marketing and product are feeling an immense amount of pressure to grow their business. And some things are within their control and some things are macro factors that are outside. And there was a mentor of mine who shared this great little equation that I always think about, which is strategy plus execution plus luck equals outcomes. And so instead of getting caught up in the macro outcomes, if you're not happy with what's happening, it allowed me to focus on how much of this is good or bad luck. And it's both good luck too. You got to call out when something externally is what's driving a good result, but also were the problems on your strategy, were it on execution, or do you feel like you could check the box that you did your best work on the thinking and the delivery so that the outcomes that you're seeing, you can still feel a sense of pride in what you're doing or understand where you need to go focused to do better next time. And I think it's really hard for my colleagues and peers, I think sometimes to detach the things within their control versus the things without their control. And they can easily carry all of that weight on their shoulders thinking it's them and only them. And if they can't fix it, they're a failure.
That's a really elegant way to put it. One of my clients, won't say their name out of respect for their privacy, but VP of growth at a very cool scale up asked me, if I'm the head of growth and this company doesn't make it and we run out of money and we fold the company or whatever, will I be viewed as a failure? And I'm like, dude, you're so successful. Objectively, looking at their resume and their accomplishments, so successful, so smart, so accomplished, but it's really easy to feel that way. And so I didn't articulate it as elegantly as you did, but we talked about doing work that you could feel really proud of, right? So putting together the best strategy with the information that you've got, executing with the best rigor and attention to detail and driving towards the outcomes and, the inputs to the outcomes that we want to get. And really, if we do that, we can do amazing work that we can feel proud of regardless how the company does, because the company is so impacted by stuff outside of our control. So I like that you've got that little equation there. There's a lot of folks that need to hear that.
I would add to that too, is now on the advising side, sometimes helping these businesses or learning about these different businesses where if I'm working with them, I want to do the best work possible to help them go win and crush it. And I have a sense of pride in through my ability to go be the answer to fix their problem. But it's also been a great exercise because I'm spending a greater share of my time now looking at digging into many more business models at the same time than just being within a company for a year. And so from that, I've started to get better at understanding, well, how much of this is the business and the business model and the offering versus it being a marketing problem or product problem. In that way, I've been able to also get even better at understanding and discerning. If it doesn't work, it's not because I'm necessarily a bad advisor or the in-house talent is not great at their job. And maybe the fundamentals of this business approach is just not, or it's not going to work. And that's okay.
Sort of freeing to realize that in a way. For folks who are listening that want to learn more about you or connect with you, where should they go?
Best place is just find me on LinkedIn, Anthony Scarpaci. And you could also find me, I now have a website called TUNOMATIC.com, TUNOMATIC, which is, again, due to my guitar geekery, a nod to some guitar hardware, but that's the name I give my advising practice. And then there, I've also started to do a Substack of just quarterly updates. But LinkedIn, I post a little bit more frequently if there's certain things that I have shared or prepared for other people, presentations I've done or hot takes that I may have. I try to be rare in those. There's a lot of content on LinkedIn, so I try to be really focused on when I have something meaningful to say. But yeah, that's the best place to find me to reach out.
We'll put links to all that stuff in the show notes. Thank you for coming on, share your journey and a little bit of the game today. Appreciate it.
Appreciate it, Andrew. Thanks so much.